The holotable between us was still glowing red with enemy fleet positions when Queen Ixara leaned forward and asked me a question no human had ever been asked before. Can your people still win this war alone? I did not answer right away. Around us stood 6 Vorthali generals, tall insect-shaped warriors with plated skin and eyes like black glass, and every single one of them was watching me the way a predator watches something it has not decided to eat yet. I was the only human in that room. I was, as far as I knew, the only human left within 100 light-years who was still breathing free air instead of running from it. My name is Eli Grant, and 3 weeks earlier, I had been a communications officer on a research outpost that no longer existed. Now I stood in the war chamber of an alien queen, trying to convince her people that humanity was still worth trusting. The Skarn Dominion fleet was 2 days away, 2 days from wiping out everything the Vorthali had built across this system, and taking whatever was left of my own people along with it. Ixara's throne room smelled like ozone and burnt metal, lit by strips of blue light along the ceiling, and every screen around us showed ships that outnumbered us 4-1. I answered her honestly, because lying to a queen who could read tension in a human heartbeat felt like a fast way to die. No, I said, not alone, but together, we have a chance. One of the generals, a broad warrior named Threk, made a low clicking sound that I had learned meant contempt. The apes lost their own fleet in a single day, he said. Why should we trust their strategy with ours? I kept my eyes on Ixara, not Threk. I had learned that lesson fast in this palace. The queen made the decisions. Everyone else was just noise. Because my strategy is the only reason any of you are still alive to insult me, I said. Ixara's mandibles shifted, which I had come to recognize as something close to a smile, though I was never fully sure. She waved a clawed hand over the holotable, and the enemy formation rotated slowly in the air between us. "Show me again," she said, "where you believe they will strike first." I stepped closer to the table and traced a line of light with my finger, marking the outer moons of the system. "Here," I said, "not the capital. They want to cut off your fuel depots first, then starve the capital into surrender without losing more ships than they have to. It is what I would do." Threk snorted. "And how would an ape know how the Skarn think?" "Because humans have been doing the same thing to each other for 10,000 years, I said. "War does not change much between species, only the weapons do." Silence settled over the room. Even Ixara went still for a moment, studying me with those deep black eyes that never seemed to blink. I had spent 3 weeks learning to read her moods in the small movements of her body, since her people did not smile or frown the way humans did. This was the closest thing to respect I had seen from her yet. Then she said the words that would decide the fate of both our species. "If your plan fails, Eli Grant, the deaths of my people will be on your head, and I will not forgive that easily." "I understand," I said. I did not feel brave saying it. I felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to sound calm while the wind pushed at his back. We spent the next hour going over troop movements, ship formations, and fallback positions. The generals argued in short bursts, their voices sharp and clicking, and twice I had to stop myself from flinching at how close Threk stood when he disagreed with me. I had learned that showing fear here was worse than showing anger. The Vorthali respected conviction, even from a species they still half believed was too soft to matter. We were deep into a disagreement about which moon to defend first when the tall doors at the far end of the chamber hissed open. Every head in the room turned. A small Vorthali child stood in the doorway, barely reaching the knees of the nearest guard. Her plating was pale gold instead of the dark gray of the adults, and her eyes were wide and curious instead of sharp and calculating. She could not have been more than 5 years old in human terms. The guards froze. Nobody moved to stop her. I would learn later that royal children were kept far from war rooms, protected by 100 unspoken rules that no one dared to break, not even for a queen's own daughter. She looked around the room slowly, past the generals, past her mother, and her eyes landed on me. I was the strangest thing in that room. Pale skin, soft edges, no plating, no claws. I must have looked like something out of a story to her. She walked straight toward me. "Vesa," Ixara said sharply, but the child did not stop. I did not know what to do. My mind raced through every possible outcome. If I stepped back, would that look like rejection, an insult to the Queen's daughter? If I stayed still, would the guards see it as a threat, a human standing motionless while royalty approached? My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the whole room could hear it. Vesa stopped in front of me, tilted her head, and studied my face the way a scientist studies something new. Then she wrapped her small arms around my leg and hugged me. The room went completely silent. I looked up and saw Threk's hand twitch toward the weapon at his side. I saw two other generals exchange a look that I could not read, but that made the hair on my arms stand up. I saw Ixara rise slightly from her throne, her whole body tense, her eyes fixed on her daughter pressed against a human she had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to trust. I did not move. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my hands visible and still, to let this small creature hold onto my leg, without flinching, even though every instinct in me screamed that one wrong move here could end badly, not just for me, but for whatever fragile trust I had built between our two species. Slowly, carefully, I lowered myself down to one knee so I was closer to her height. I kept my voice soft, the way I used to talk to my little sister back home when she was scared of thunderstorms. "Hello there," I said. "You gave everyone quite a surprise." Vesa looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes, and said something in her own language, quick and musical, too fast for the small translator device on my collar to fully catch. I only understood a few words. Warm, different, safe. I glanced at Ixara, silently asking permission to keep speaking, and something in her expression shifted. It was not quite approval, but it was not the fury I had braced for either. "I am Eli," I told the child slowly, pointing to myself. She repeated it, stumbling over the sound. "Eli." "Close enough," I said, and I smiled. I do not know what made her hug me. Maybe it was curiosity, the simple fascination of a child seeing something new for the first time, without the weight of history or war clouding her judgment. Maybe children everywhere, human or Vorthali, simply recognize kindness before they learn to be afraid of what is different. Whatever the reason, that small act cracked something open in that room that no negotiation, no battle plan, no clever argument from me had managed to touch in 3 long weeks. Threk stepped forward, his voice low and hard. "My queen, this is not appropriate. The child should not be near the human." Ixara raised a hand, and Threk stopped instantly, though his eyes stayed locked on me with open suspicion. "I did not summon her here," Ixara said quietly, "and yet she came." She descended from her throne, moving with the same slow, deliberate grace I had watched for 3 weeks. But there was something different in her posture now, something less guarded. She knelt beside her daughter, resting a clawed hand gently on Vesa's small shoulder. "Vesa," she said, "why did you come to him?" Vesa looked up at her mother, then back at me, then answered simply. "He is not scared of us," she said, "and he does not want to hurt us. I can feel it." The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not tense, something closer to disbelief. Children of her species, I would learn later that evening from one of the palace attendants, possessed a rare sensitivity in their early years, an instinct for reading intention that adults eventually lost as they grew older and learned to mask their feelings behind careful expressions and practiced words. It was considered a myth among most Vorthali scholars, an old story told to explain why the very young sometimes trusted strangers that the rest of the hive instinctively distrusted. Ixara, it seemed, believed it was more than a myth. She studied me for a long moment, her daughter still holding onto my leg, and I held her gaze without looking away, even though everything in me wanted to look down, to make myself smaller, to disappear from the weight of that stare. "Perhaps," Ixara said slowly, "there is wisdom in innocence that we have forgotten how to hear." Threk made a sound of disagreement, but he did not speak again. No one argued with the queen when she used that tone. Ixara reached down and gently coaxed her daughter away from my leg, lifting her into her arms. Vesa waved at me over her mother's shoulder, small fingers wiggling, and despite everything, despite the war fleet 2 days from wiping out everything I had left in this galaxy, I found myself smiling and waving back. "Take her to her chambers," Ixara said to a waiting attendant, "and ensure she remains there until the council ends." The attendant bowed and carried Vesa away, the small girl still looking back at me, until the doors closed behind her. Once she was gone, the room seemed to exhale collectively, though the tension had not fully left. Ixara returned to her throne, but she did not sit immediately. She stood beside it, looking down at me as I rose back to my feet. "You handled that well," she said. "I did not do anything," I said honestly. "I just did not move." "Sometimes," she said, "that is the hardest thing to do." Threk cleared his throat, clearly eager to return the conversation to something he understood. "My queen, the enemy fleet does not care for children's instincts. We are wasting time." Ixara turned to him, and something in her voice hardened again, back to the commander I had first met 3 weeks ago. "You are right," she said. "Let us finish this." We returned to the holotable, but something between us had changed. I could feel it in the way the generals looked at me now, less like a stray animal that had wandered into their war room, and more like something they were still deciding how to categorize, but no longer dismissing outright. Even Threk, though his voice remained sharp, no longer spoke over me the way he had before. We spent the next 2 hours finalizing the defense. I laid out 3 possible formations, and for the first time since I had arrived in this palace, the generals actually debated my ideas, instead of simply tolerating them. We argued over fuel reserves, over which moons could be sacrificed if it came to that, over how fast the Vorthali capital ships could reposition if the Skarn fleet changed direction at the last moment. By the time we finished, the war table showed a plan that was not perfect, but it was strong. Strong enough that even Threk grudgingly admitted it gave us better odds than anything the Vorthali High Command had proposed on their own. As the generals filed out to relay orders to their ships, Ixara remained behind, studying the holographic map in silence. I lingered near the door, unsure whether I was dismissed or expected to stay. "Eli Grant," she said, without turning around. "Yes, my queen." "Why do you fight for us?" she asked. "Your people are scattered. Your fleet is gone. You have no obligation to help a species that treated you with suspicion since the day you arrived." I thought about the question carefully before answering. It was not the first time someone had asked me something similar, but it was the first time I felt like the answer actually mattered. "Because if I stop fighting," I said, "then everything my people believed in dies with them. And because somewhere out there, if any of my people are still alive, I want them to come back to a galaxy that still has room for both of us in it." Ixara finally turned to face me. "That is a very human answer," she said, "full of hope even when the odds do not favor it." "Maybe that is not such a bad thing to be full of," I said. For the first time since I had met her, something that looked almost like warmth crossed her face. "My daughter is rarely wrong about people," she said. "She has an instinct even I sometimes envy. When she came to you today, she confirmed something I had already begun to suspect." "What is that?" I asked. "That you are not fighting beside us because you have nowhere else to go," Ixara said. "You are fighting because you actually believe we deserve to survive this. That is different from obligation. That is choice." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply nodded. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we prepare the fleet. The day after, we fight." I left the war chamber that night, walking slower than I had in weeks. Not because I was tired, though I was, but because for the first time since my outpost fell, I did not feel entirely alone in this fight. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Ships were repositioned according to the plan we had built. Supply lines were secured. Fighters were fueled and armed. I spent most of the day moving between command stations, answering questions, adjusting small details as new information came in about the Skarn fleet's movement. Late in the afternoon, as I crossed through one of the palace corridors on my way to the eastern docks, I heard quick footsteps behind me and turned to see Vesa running toward me, trailed by an exhausted-looking attendant who was clearly struggling to keep up with her. She skidded to a stop in front of me and held up something small clutched in her hand. It was a tiny carved figure, roughly shaped like a human, crudely made but clearly crafted with care. "I made this," she said proudly, holding it up. "For you. So you remember us when you go to fight." I knelt down and took the small figure from her hands, turning it over gently. It was rough, uneven, clearly the work of small, clumsy fingers, but it was one of the most meaningful things anyone had given me in a very long time. "Thank you, Vesa," I said. "I will keep this with me." "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller, less certain than before. I looked at her, this small creature from a species I had spent 3 weeks learning to understand, who had shown me more open trust in one moment than most of the adults in this palace had shown in 3 weeks combined. "I am going to try my best," I said honestly. "That is all I can promise anyone right now." She nodded slowly, seeming to accept that answer, even though I could tell she wanted a stronger one. The attendant finally caught up and gently guided her back toward the inner palace, though she looked back at me twice before disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a long moment, holding the small carved figure in my hand, before slipping it carefully into my jacket pocket and continuing on toward the docks. That night, as our combined fleet moved into position at the edge of the system, I stood on the bridge of Ixara's flagship beside her, watching the stars shift slowly as thousands of ships aligned into formation. Vorthali cruisers moved alongside the handful of surviving human vessels I had managed to coordinate through emergency channels over the past 3 weeks, small in number but sharp in purpose. The Skarn fleet would arrive within hours. Ixara stood beside me in silence for a long while before speaking. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "my people will remember that a human stood beside us when he had every reason to walk away." I touched the small figure in my pocket without thinking, feeling its rough, uneven edges beneath my fingers. "And I will remember that your daughter reminded me why this fight is worth having," I said. Ixara looked at me, and for the first time since I had arrived in this strange palace among a species so different from my own, I saw something in her expression that needed no translator to understand. Respect. Perhaps even something close to gratitude. "Get some rest, Eli Grant," she said. "Tomorrow, we show the galaxy what an alliance can accomplish." I nodded and turned to leave the bridge, but before I did, I glanced back one final time at the star map glowing softly across the viewport, thousands of ships from 2 different worlds standing together against a common threat. Somewhere deep in the palace behind us, a small girl who had never known war the way the rest of us did, was probably already asleep, unaware that her simple act of trust had done more to unite 2 species than any negotiation or battle plan ever could. I walked back toward my quarters with the weight of tomorrow's battle heavy on my shoulders, but for the first time in 3 long weeks, that weight felt like something I did not have to carry alone. Whatever happened when the sun rose, I knew one thing for certain now. We were not just allies bound by desperation anymore. We had become something closer to family, forged not through strategy or diplomacy, but through the simple, fearless hug of a child who had looked at a stranger and seen only kindness, where everyone else had seen only difference. And that, I realized, walking through the quiet corridors of an alien palace light years from everything I had ever known, might just be the thing that saved us all.